I hope everybody saw in their briefing materials the amazing article that Rana did a couple of years ago, and we fell in love with her writing and her ability to moderate a group, and we're thrilled she said yes. So Jean, your your prediction comes true. So Rana, I want to give you the mic and welcome you to the moderating chair for our first session on household savings and its key role in macroeconomic growth. So thank you.
Thanks so much for having me. It's an honor to be here for the first time and experience Aspen, and to meet all of you, some of whom I've talked to, interviewed, done punditry with, et cetera. So it's nice to have everybody in one room talking about all this stuff. Just to quickly set the stage, we're going to have a really inclusive, vigorous exchange here. We're going to start for a few minutes, myself and the panelists kind of drawing out some of the key issues, but we should, in a 30 minutes or so, I think, start in on questions if you have them. And if you do have a question, if you want to just kind of stick your name card up like that so I can see you, and we'll make sure to give everybody time. We have a nice, good, long session, so everybody should have a chance to get to what they want. So I'll just start. I'm not going to reintroduce Jean, Josh, and Congressman Neal because you already have their bios and know them. But I'll just start by asking Jean, I think, to set the stage with some of these issues. You know, I was reading, and I don't know if some of you have read, the really wonderful piece of research that you did in exchange, Savings for America, in conjunction with the Goldman Sachs Institute. And that was done in 2006. But I was really struck by the fact that a lot of it could have been written today. And so maybe you can kind of briefly encompass some of the key findings from that, why savings is so important for macroeconomic growth, and kind of take us from 2006 to today.
Sure. Well, I think many, if not all of us, are here in large part because we care about the micro economic aspect of savings. That is, we really worry about the fact that saving is not well distributed, that people, particularly the bottom third, the bottom half of the income distribution, wealth distribution, however you want to count it, are not very secure financially, and we want to do something about it. But it's also a macroeconomic issue. That is, it's an economy-wide issue, because to the extent you have a significant portion of the population that are financially insecure, that has implications for their saving rate. And the reason we save is not just for its own sake. The reason we save is because that leads to investment in the economy. It's that higher level of investment that leads to growth in the economy. And I want to be clear, of course, that when we talk about investment and saving, you know, in the broad sense, we're also talking about human capital investment and not just financial or real capital investment. But the financial capital, the financial savings is also what often makes possible the investment in education. So there's a broader macroeconomic issue which has to do with building up additional levels of saving and investment. And there's another play on it, and Congressman Neal, I think, referred to this yesterday for those of you who were here in the evening, which is also the extent you put people in conditions of debt. I think they often tend to be less risk takers. So I worry a lot about what we're doing to our youth coming out of school. It's not that if they're successful, I don't mind taxing them more, given that we help them get through school, but the notion of throwing them into substantial piles of debt means that they themselves, this isn't just low-income people who are low-income because of where they are in the income distribution. It's also sometimes low-income because that's where they're starting out in the life cycle, and they start off at a slower basis. And the youth today, by the way, for instance, are forming families later. They're investing in business a little less. They're certainly investing in housing less. That leads to less investment in the economy, and again has these macroeconomic implications. So that was broadly what we were talking about in this paper, that's to try to indicate that there were not just these micro or individual level concerns, but they really play out at a much broader level at society-wide. Actually, I should add the final one, of course, is to the extent people are financially insecure, then our social welfare system turns more and more to not working on what I think most of us care about, which is the opportunity agenda, and it works more and more on trying to provide minimum levels of consumption. And while I think we need to do that to protect people at the bottom, that itself is not an investment agenda. And so in some sense, I think what we're about is trying to convert what I think many of us may view as a vicious cycle in the economy into a virtuous cycle. If we get more investment, we get more saving, particularly if we get it across the income and the wealth distribution, it leads to growth, it leads to more education, it leads to people taking more risk, it leads to higher levels of growth, and it builds upon itself. And it's that virtuous cycle that in a macro, not just in a microeconomic sense, that we're trying to build.
Okay, that's a good overview. I'm going to come back to that point on risk a little later, which I think is fascinating. There was actually a great article in the Wall Street Journal recently about this very topic. And I also want to get your take a little bit later on the historical shifts in U.S. savings rate and how it compares internationally as well. But first, Josh, I want to jump to you. I know you had asked me to give the caveat that even though you're a pensions guy, you've worked in government, as you said, and you have a lot to say on macroeconomics, which nobody doubts. So I know one of your issues is that you feel that the debt and deficit conversation has really overshadowed a lot of other things, like the importance of savings and some of these other issues that you've been talking about. Do you want to pick up on that?
Yeah, I think I have a friend who said that we are the victims of deficit attention syndrome.
I'm going to steal that, by the way. That's going in my next column.
Yes, and yeah, I think you have to copyright Stuart Brown. But anyway, I'm quite ambivalent about this debate and discussion. I was an official in the Office of Management and Budget when, in the Clinton administration, they both proposed a balanced budget and later on achieved a balanced budget. And so it's not that one shouldn't think about these issues. I also believe it is hard to argue for government activism if the average person thinks that the government can't balance its checkbook. But what has happened, unfortunately, is that because the deficits have gotten so large, and since most people don't even know who Keynes is, much less what Keynesian economics is, that the fact of the deficit and getting the deficit down has overshadowed the question of how we do it and where we do it. And so we got, as Congressman Neal mentioned last night, there have been a variety of stopgap measures to reduce the deficit, but they have all focused, they have mostly focused, to be fair, they have mostly focused on cutting the discretionary part of the federal budget, on cutting aid to education and national parks and national defense and things like that, et cetera. They have, with one exception, not asked the question of what is a fair tax system and how should we pay for what we need in government. They have not asked the question of, as more and more baby boomers retire, as more and more of our population is elderly, how do we pay for Social Security and Social Security and Medicare? And so I think we have gotten ourselves to a point where what is clearly an important discussion has been kind of hijacked. And in one sense, I'm kind of ambivalently standing in for Maya McGinnis, who is a friend. And I think it's worth noting, and I think it's important, that when the Fix the Debt campaign came out, what they said was, and they had both business Democrats and Republicans, I can't say they had liberal and conservative, but they had a range of folks there. What you need to do now is first get the economy moving again. What you need to do now is to prime the pump, but at the same time give people some assurance that over the long run the government will in fact balance the checkbook. And unfortunately, the first part got lost in the debate, and that's what I think we need to always pay attention to.
Okay, great. Congressman, I want to pick up, before you came, someone in the audience was talking about how we need to get to action and not just talk. We need to really, have policies in place, come up with ideas to fix the situation. I know you have a lot of ideas. I missed your talk last night because my plane was late, but tell us some of the things that you're working on and why you think federal policies around savings are so important right now.
Well, I'd like, if I could, just to pick up on what Jean and Josh said just for a moment, because I think it's very relevant. Many of you have careers that have been spent in Washington or working in different agencies or on staff positions for members of Congress. But I just want to, because Jean mentioned the point of crowding out when the government is in deficit, it crowds out investment. That's really a key consideration. But I think there's something else that I want to share this with you. On January 19th, when Bill Clinton said goodbye, we were staring at almost a $5.7 trillion surplus projected for 15 years, and given projections are but projections. I mean, a downturn could change all of that. And
Maybe it was 3 trillion.
Maybe it was 3 trillion. But I had voted for those 3 budgets. Bush won and Clinton twice. And Bush Sr. gets credit, I think, for having had the courage to take a look at where those deficits were headed and saying, we've got to do something about it. And some might argue, by the way, that it cost him his job. And so I recall, because I've been very active on this front with deficits and had befriended Rubin and Summers and really embraced, I thought, pro-growth economic policy. So I was invited to the White House within a matter of days of President Bush Jr. Taking the oath, maybe 10 or 12 days in. And there were about 6 or 7 of us from the Ways and Means Committee. And I recall that Vice President Cheney was there, and I had served with him in the House. And Secretary O'Neill was there. And President Bush laid out his plan for tax cuts, $1.3 trillion in 2001. And I recall ever so diplomatically and respectfully saying to him, Mr. President, why don't we stick to paying down the debt? Why don't we just stay with that position? I mean, see, I think that there's a short memory cycle. And here's the problem. Alan Greenspan said you're paying down the debt too quickly. The clock in Times Square had been turned off, chronicling the debt. So we had taken a series of these very difficult votes, and some might argue it cost us the House in '94. But at the same time, we were on this kind of glide path. And President Bush dismissed immediately what I had to say, and I went back to challenging the assumptions, suggesting, well, if we're to have tax cuts, what about some modest tax cuts for middle-income Americans and continue to pay down the debt? I can't emphasize enough how much money there was at that time. So not only did the president reject my position in 2001, but we came back and cut them by $1 trillion more in 2003. So we have $2.3 trillion worth of tax cuts, and you should know I was consistent. I opposed them when President Obama attempted to extend the tax cuts, which he did. So we had 12 years of tax cuts with 2 wars. And I think that the difficulty is, I'm going to come to this very succinct point. Theology cannot replace arithmetic. And that's what's happened. People show up with their own set of opinions, and they call them facts. And I remember those days of, just kind of, I bumped into George Mitchell recently, and I was having a conversation with him with some humor, and I said, isn't it remarkable that we're hearing people on the other side take credit for these budget balancing acts? And Mitchell said, it's funny, he said, not one of them voted for it in the House. And at the same time, that plan worked. So we came back and we had these massive tax cuts when you consider what happened, and then an economic downturn. So we were ill prepared for it.
Gene, you wanted to jump in and say something?
Yeah, I agree with the Congressman about arithmetic. Yogi Berra once said 90% of baseball is mental and the other half is physical. So sometimes we have to watch how we play. There's no doubt that the first decade of the 21st century was the most profligate fiscally in our nation's history. We not only had tax cuts, but we had defense spending increases. We had a major entitlement increase with the drug benefit that we didn't pay for at all. And we actually had significant discretionary spending increases, and we went from surplus to deficit, and even excluding the Great Recession, to an order of magnitude greater than anything ever in our history. But I still want people to realize that even as we try to come out of this and we deal with a world that's called a deficit, there's still remarkable ability to channel resources. And if you look at the way the budget's done, you look at Congressional Budget Office numbers or OMB numbers, they actually project out 5 years and 10 years into the future, basically economic growth. They take economic growth 2% or 3% a year, depending on how conservative they are and where the economy is. They project it out. Well, 10 years of economic growth would give you an economy that's 25% richer, 30% richer. And then they project that revenues will go up actually by at least that much because we get a recovery from a recession. We have a little bracket creep. So revenues go up maybe 30, 35%. And so you get a budget. If you look at President Obama's last budget, for instance, he proposes about $1 trillion more spending in 10 years than we have today. Now, about $250 billion or so of that's just more interest on the debt because interest rates are expected to rise and we're not taking care of the debt. About 800 billion or so is going for Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid, excluding children. The children's budget's going into tailspin, and as Josh says, the discretionary budget, partly because this Congress, this president have obligated future Congresses to keep discretionary spending down, basically goes nowhere. So education spending goes down, child credits go down, everything else. So one of the questions is, how do you take that money and rechannel it for things you want? So let me quickly turn to the asset development. I won't take much time. The asset development side, if you look there actually is growth there too, because the tax subsidies, particularly the tax subsidies for housing and pensions, keep growing over time too. They're on the order of about 300 billion, I'm not sure I remember correctly, a year right now. Give another 5 or 10 years of growth, they're expected, I think 5 years are expected to grow about 40 billion, 10 years, 100 billion. So there is money, a lot of money being channeled in ways that have been determined by people basically often in the middle of the last century as to how they design these policies. And so I think part of what we're about today is how can we take some of that growth that is there, even in the midst of these budget crises or these budget problems, take some of that growth and channel it where we really think it should go, both distributionally in terms of lower income people sharing more in it, because they don't share at all in the housing and pension subsidies, and also redistribute in ways that we think is more efficient, that actually produces these opportunities.
Okay, that's a very good point, and maybe a good point too to go to a little historical context. You raised the issue, which I think actually doesn't get enough attention, that we should really be thinking about growth, how to foster growth, rather than having a conversation about cuts and tax increases that is sort of stultifying. Tell us a little bit, since you have the historical context on this, about how household savings rates in this country have related to growth historically, and also how we compare internationally and what we should learn from that.
Well, I mean, as everyone knows, our savings rate has gone very much in a tailspin. I want to be a little careful here, because as we invest more and more in human capital, our measures, our ability to measure saving has gotten worse and worse. So we don't really measure well how much Microsoft or Apple or any of these other companies really invest. I mean, we try to, but we don't really measure human capital investment very well. But nonetheless, there's a period of time, I mentioned this $300 billion of tax subsidies for saving, mainly in the pension and housing area. It was actually at a point in time, at one point, where the personal saving rate was 0. Now, personal saving doesn't count some corporate save, stuff like that, but the two statistics just show you whatever we're doing with these subsidies, they're not operating very well in terms of promoting saving. And remember, this is both a liberal and a conservative agenda. Promoting investment and saving appeals to people in both parties, as does the opportunity agenda that both candidates had. And so we're not doing very well there on the saving front. And let me be clear about it. It's not just, some people here might not agree with this. It's not just us at the high end not saving. It's often people in the middle of the income distribution, that are not saving the extent they can. I still remember, Dave Walker's not here, but one of his films on, I still remember, it was a film basically on dealing with the budget and the deficit. And they showed this couple in China that was living in this little sort of one-room shack. Their stove was this little pot boiler over here. And they were talking, we make $30 a week, and we're saving half of that because we want to buy something. So the fact is middle income people can save. It's hard to do, but so the question of whether we're adequately saving the society permeates our society as a whole. It just doesn't. We don't save in the middle. We don't save at low income levels, and even at the high income levels, a lot of the saving tends to be dissipated in ways.
Josh, you want to jump in on this?
Yeah, I want to make 2 points. One is, it's hard to have household saving when you don't have household income.
Right.
Okay. And when, I'm actually proud to say the Clinton administration was an exception, but when wages have stagnated for a generation and the distribution of income has gotten worse, you cannot expect people to save more. Now,
I don't think the rate of saving has to go down, though.
well, it may not have to go.
Incomes have not gone up as much as we like, but the rate of saving should not be necessarily going down.
It may not have to go down, but the fact is there has been as much dissaving, and that's actually my second, which is the financial services revolution, of which I am admittedly, and I say it up front, a clear beneficiary, so I can't diss it, et cetera, has innovated many more ways to find ways for people to dissave than to save. So, over the last generation, since I'm in the retirement security end, you're able to borrow against your IRA, and about 25% of people do it. When you look at who does it, the answer is people at the lower end, people when they're in trouble, et cetera, et cetera. But it's not just on the retirement side. The fact of the matter is the credit card revolution, all of these have facilitated, if you will, dissaving, lack of savings, spending. And so put them together, which is stagnating wages, and a financial services industry, which is, and I don't want to ding the financial services industry, I'm from it, but has innovated much more in finding ways for people to spend and borrow than to save. And the result is that people are saving. And so I think the challenge, if you will, is one is, can we get wages up and growth up, et cetera? Can we have a more progressive tax code? But secondly, are there ways to level the spending versus borrowing, the saving versus borrowing palette, if you will, frankly, from you guys in the financial services?
Okay, good point.
Just a couple of thoughts on the technical side of it.
Yep.
It was such a great idea that I actually offered it. It was automatic enrollment. That was my amendment. I pushed for the idea you had to opt out of savings plans or pension work. I had to say you weren't going to do it. The culprit here, just to make a generalization, is the 28-year-old male. The employer says to him, look, you can have the cash in your pocket, or you can have health care, or you can have the cash in your pocket, or I can set it aside in a pension. That 28-year-old male is always going to say the same thing. Let me have the cash. So I think that becomes an important consideration on the technical side. The saver's credit that I've offered, which I think has enormous opportunity in terms of doubling it, making it refundable. But if you want to take advantage of having it doubled, you have to apply the second portion to your IRA. You get credit for it. So if you're setting aside $400 with the savings credit, if you're willing to set aside $800, that extra $400 goes towards your IRA. And I mentioned last night the auto IRA proposal that I have, and I've been focused on this for a long, long period of time. But I must tell you that my conclusion is that the employer plays an essential role here. That's the best way to do savings, having the employer take it out of your paycheck every week when you don't see it.
Aside from these kind of behavioral nudges that you're talking about, are there any other kind of big, real change-making policies that you see that we should be implementing?
Well, I mean, I think the typical argument in Washington always goes back to the same old, and it crowds out, if I might use Gene's term, it crowds out fresh thinking. And I think that ideology, again, trumps all. Kind of fall back to these traditional positions. And I think that the fresh thinking is discouraged. And my sense is that if you wake up every day and the other side can never even have a remotely good idea, you make a huge mistake. I think there are some good ideas. Let me just say a nice word about Pat Teaberry, he does the majority side of tax work. I did it for 4 years before being thrust back into the minority, but he's okay with the auto IRA. The problem he's got is in the base of his party. They reject the idea of a mandate. I think that the mandate is necessary for the purpose of prescribed savings.
Okay, so we'll come back to some sort of practical implications of policies, but Josh and Gene, I want to actually summarize a couple things that you all just said and kind of consolidate. Josh, you're saying that really we need to think about the issue of wages, why they're stagnating, and focus on that as a way of increasing savings, right?
Yeah.
Okay, and Gene, you're saying that stagnating wages don't necessarily have to mean lower savings.
Certainly society-wide. So, I mean, the distinction I'm making, if I'm unemployed, I'm going to just save. I mean, there's no doubt. If I'm worse off, I'm more likely to move into saving. But I'm actually just arguing. I don't like the argument that they have stagnating wages, therefore they're lower middle class instead of middle class, whatever. Therefore, they can't save. The simple fact is, throughout the vast majority of our history, people in lower middle class have saved. And it's also an issue with the stagnating wages. First place, it doesn't mean, and in aggregates, that savings should go down, because if the distribution of income or wealth is becoming worse, you still don't expect people at the top to save less, right? So there's no reason why the rate of savings should go down. Franklin Roosevelt, wasn't quite saving, but we were in the middle of the Depression. They didn't say, well, gee, we can't enact Social Security because that's going to take money out of people's paychecks, which it did. I mean, you can bump up a rate of saving even at the same time you're trying to work on increasing income income growth in the economy. I don't think that they're inconsistent positions. And we have to be clear, if we really want to increase, this is the tension in this group, and especially when this group deals with other, I have to say, liberal groups. If the goal is to increase saving, an increased saving goal is a goal for decreasing consumption, or at least increasing the rate of consumption out of income to some extent, because that's what saving is. It's deferred consumption that eventually makes possible greater consumption later on.
So this is a very important point. What you seem to be implying is that there's some short-term, long-term trade-offs here, that there may be short-term pain for what you think would be a more sustainable growth model longer term.
Well, by analogy, Josh was talking about what we do in the recession. In the recession, we actually want to increase consumption. You want to increase the rate of, you want to increase total consumption, and at the same time you're increasing the rate of saving. They're not inconsistent. The rate of saving can get you in the long-term path of actually increasing saving, but initially you actually want to stimulate the economy. You can actually do
jump
both.
in.
Can
Please
I
jump in.
respectfully demur? Okay. I am second to none in my admiration for, but 106th in my understanding of the macro implications of savings. That's not personally why I think we're here. I think we're here because financial security is, for a large fraction of America, at best standing still, and I think getting worse. And so, at least that's what the polls say. You are right that it's not written in the heavens and it's not written in laws of economics that when times get rough, people who earn less save less, but the fact is that they do.
No, I said the people who are less
If
safe.
I may, the Employee Benefit Research Institute just did an update on their analysis of who does what 401. And 401ks are, in my view, a mixed blessing, but they are the dominant form of retirement savings. And what they said is that when you looked at the changes from 2009 to today in participation in 401ks, people who earned more than $35,000 a year were saving just as much now as they were before the crash in 08 and 09. And people who were, that all of the dis-saving, if you will, the majority of it was people earning $35,000 and less. And so, from my perspective, society-wide, I'm not going to argue. What the theoretical possibilities are, I will not argue. I think, as a practical matter, it is the case that we make it harder for people to save, which is why I'm personally for Kevin De Leon's proposal, et cetera. We give them they have less wherewithal with which to do it. And then because of the way the tax code is structured, we actually tax them more. I mean, the biggest tax increase that was just voted was a tax increase on working people. And so that has consequences too. That has consequences on the ability to save.
The tax, our tax structure and how unequal it is and all the myriad ways that it sort of discourages savings, particularly at the low end, is really interesting. I know that, Gene, you wrote a lot about that in your paper. Do you want to talk a little bit about what you think is happening?
Well, I mean, basically, the simple story is most people save most of their money in retirement and housing. And in the retirement area, basically, you have almost no incentive at the bottom. The saver's credit isn't refundable. Congressman Neal would probably make it refundable. And Congressman Neal also wants to increase saving by actually trying to make sure some of that money goes into deposit as opposed to just being cashed out. But of the pension end, there's basically almost no benefits. On the housing end, it's actually even worse because you could argue, at least in areas where land is a little more scarce, that those of us who get the tax incentives therefore build up the price of housing and the price of land, thus make it actually harder for the low-income people who don't get any incentives to even buy. So in that area, we probably even discourage home buying, which is the main way people save. I mean, the main way people save is they pay off mortgages and they get into some sort of retirement scheme, defined benefit or defined contribution, where it's not just people talk about the power of compound interest. It's the power of making that deposit and that payment year or month after month, week after week, year after year. That's what happens when you pay off a mortgage, even in a bad housing market. What happens when you constantly put money in a pension plan over time. That's how people build up saving. And I'll challenge you. I'll bet if I looked at the portfolios of 90, if not 100% of the people here, and you looked at it, I'm willing to guess that 60, 70 or more % of your net assets are in pensions and housing.
Yeah, go
One
ahead.
of the
Congressman.
things I think that you touched upon again, and Josh hit upon it as well, it was what housing did for our parents' generation. In many instances, it was that VA loan. And it worked miraculously. And the housing market from the post-war generation really worked as envisioned. I'm not so sure that's going to happen today. And you can see, again, I think a reflection of income disparity with the size of some homes that are being built. I mean, you don't have to be a rocket scientist if you're in coastal America to see what's happened to the size of the homes. And that is not filtered down to people who want to get into the market. Now, one of the things that I did years ago, and take some credit for it on the 401k front, because I hear members of Congress say, for example, we've got to get rid of the 401k plan and go back to defined benefit. Well, you know what? Count me in. But you know what else? It's not going to happen, so leave it alone. That's just reality. We are not going back to a defined benefit. I don't see any evidence to support that. So at the same time...
But that doesn't mean we shouldn't preserve the ones we have.
Exactly.
Yeah.
No, absolutely correct.
Right.
But at the same time, one of the things that I proposed was, you were talking about that, being able to take money out of your IRA. That was my proposal. For housing purposes, you could borrow against your 401k or your IRA. I thought that was a good investment, good long-term investment. So if you borrowed from your 401k, and you use it for a down payment or you use it for housing cost, I thought that was a good way to use some retirement savings, the idea being that it would capture or recaptured as you approached retirement years. And I think that's the way we want to think of these things. And again, I think ideology gets in the way of some of this thinking.
Josh, do you agree with that?
In part, yes. I think the biggest point was the one that Congressman Neal made last night, which is, unfortunately, but it's a fact, the vast majority of tax incentives work for people, frankly, with incomes like mine, not for the average person, and definitely not for the poor. And so I think one part of the agenda has to be, if you're going to have if you're going to have incentives, how do you make them available to the others? But the other piece of this, which from my perspective, is the part that you talked about with auto enrollment, that Senator De Leon is trying to do in the state of California, and that I'm glad to hear that David John said one other state has done, which is there need to be mechanisms to make it, it should not be easier for people, average working people, to spend money and to borrow money than it is to save. And right now it unquestionably is. And so auto enrollment, expansion of auto enrollment, auto escalation is something that I think ought to clearly...
Employer-based.
Yes, and actually that gets to one other point I will make. Congressman Neal made the point with which I very, very strongly agree, that employers are infinitely better than average people at making these miserably complex financial decisions. And yet, we have, as a matter of government policy, for now almost 2 generations, made the employer the guarantor of the result, made the employer the fiduciary who is responsible for understanding, disclosure, et cetera. And as a result, a lot of employers have said thanks, but no thanks. And so I think one of the real challenges, and this is a very difficult challenge, is can we rethink how we actually oversee and regulate retirement issues and employee benefit issues so that employers can do what they are really good at, which is making choices without leaving beneficiaries, without leaving individuals unprotected, unoverseen.
Gene, you're nodding.
Yeah, this is a difficult issue, and I'm not saying this is the right solution, but it's one that Congress has tended to go to, is if there's employer money in pension plans, there's been more willingness maybe just to let the employers keep it in retirement solution and not borrow against it. Same thing for government money. There's been more reluctance to say if it's employee money, you can't take out your own money. Now, in my view as an economist, the employer contribution is coming out of their wages anyway, but we do need to worry about how we keep some of this money in retirement solution, and therefore I'm one of the people who actually thinks we want to think about ways of increasing employer contributions as well, maybe by making tougher discrimination rules. so that.
Can you be more specific about that? What
The
would you-
discrimination rule says that if I'm at the high end on my firm and I'm getting some benefits, I have certain things I have to do to carry along my low-income population. At one point, that was considered a way we were really going to get pensions distributed throughout the income distribution. It's pretty much fallen apart over time, but there's, and that mainly applies to DB plans. To DC plans, yes, but it does, the money doesn't stay in solution. So I just think that there are ways that maybe we could say that we're going to cut back on the benefits you get at the high end unless you do a better job of carrying along your low-income employees.
I think you just encapsulated one of the real difficulties in how we rethink this. There, for really good and understandable reasons, we have very carefully specified and regulated how employers can offer benefits to themselves in the hope and expectation that that will make sure that they treat their employees fairly by comparison. And the response of a very large part of the employer community has been to say, well, I'm getting out. And so as a result now, the dominant, the corporate 1,000, et cetera, those folks, they get their benefits on a non-tax qualified basis. They have left the system. And yet, where we are is that that set of rules has simultaneously let employers get out and resulted in employers cutting back on employee benefits. So that's a case where I think the result of good intentions and change over time has been a reduction. A question I would raise, and I don't know the answer to it is, but for example, we've now, thank you Michael Barr and his colleagues, et cetera, we now have a Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. We have a governmental institute, and I'm assuming there's going to be some point at which we talk about what it can do and what it should do, et cetera. But now that we have a new institution whose job it is to oversee financial services, does it make sense to rethink what CFPB does versus what we impose on employers? I'm not saying the answer is yes, but it seems to me that that's the sort of rethinking that we need to do if we're not going to simply blunder into a world in which employers say thanks but no thanks.
I mean, just to clarify, I don't want the details here, but I'm arguing for a vastly simplified discrimination rule, but one that does a better job at getting a minimum level of contribution one way or the other.
Congressman, you wanted to...
The technical term we used during those years when we began this discussion was top-heavy rules.
Right.
That in many pension plans, the rules clearly scaled to help people at the very top, and the benefit was not necessarily one that made its way to the bottom of the employee workforce. But one of the concepts that I've been very active on for a long period of time is the use of the ESOP, employee-owned companies, and there's some pretty good evidence out there as to how this works. And if I might just point this out to you, it's on the tax expenditure hit list. So again, last night I thought I was lying in bed with some great humor when we were talking about Governor Pawlenty last night. He made that sweeping generalization where he said it was time to get rid of all these items in the code, all of these preferences. And then he was asked, but with my prompting, he was asked, would he get rid of the homeowner deduction? And he quickly said, no. And that's kind of the challenge that we all have.
Yeah,
He wouldn't get rid of that one.
I think,
but the ESOP protection in the code is well-grounded, and it works fairly well.
we've raised a number of topics that could probably have their own sessions here. I want to encourage everybody to jump into the conversation. If you have comments or questions, to start putting your little cards up. I'll just, while folks are thinking of their questions, I'll just raise one more topic. Josh, we were speaking at breakfast about how there's this incredibly rich conversation, sometimes stalled, but rich, about the deficit. But there's really not a broad national conversation about how to fix retirement. Why is that, and what can we do to change that?
I have wondered this myself in the 3 years that I've been at the PBGC. Why is it that the deficit, which is, let's face it, a long-term issue, but not about to cause the collapse of government, gets attention?
That's the point.
Why is it that climate change, which is a long-term issue and gets some attention, not agreement, but attention in government, but the diminution of retirement security doesn't? And my current guess is because it doesn't happen in a place where Lori, James, et cetera, can see it happen at once. For example, over the past decade, the number of elderly people who have moved back in with their parents, have moved back in with their children, has skyrocketed. Skyrocketed. But since it doesn't happen, they don't march on Washington and say, we're in terrible shape and we're moving back with our kids. They just do it. It doesn't get the attention of the Fourth Estate or these folks. And so what I am hoping is that since it is the case, actually, let me add one more fact. Notwithstanding the fact that this is a slow crisis, probably the violation of the term crisis, it is nonetheless one which more and more people are worried about. Ebry, Gallup, et cetera, when they poll people, what do they worry about? They worry less about whether or not they have health care, maybe they should, than they do about whether or not they will be able to retire. And so what I am hoping, but don't know, is whether or not the fact that there is a broad, widely based nervousness can translate itself into a discussion among the well-meaning, and then can get to the point where Congressman Neal and his colleagues could actually do something.
Can I suggest two related reasons? But they both have to do with denial, and their denial of the really big numbers, because when you're talking about changes in something like retirement policy or saving policy, you're talking about, if you really want to be effective, you're talking about big numbers. So if you wanted to increase the saving rate in the economy by 1%, that's $160 billion. And if a lot of that was tax preferred, that's going to involve a $40 or $50 billion a year annual loss in revenues. In times of deficits, that's pretty hard to do. I mean, you're like, if you could get a $1 billion auto IRA provision, or I don't know what the auto IRA costs now. There's one of them that's $2 or $3 billion, but right. But it's very modest, and it's actually the modesty of the cost that makes it possible. But the very modesty of the cost means it's only going to do so much in really promoting retirement. So if we really want to get on asset development, the simple fact is we've got to start talking about big numbers, and the deficit works against that. The other disconnect, the other denial, is that basically we've got a system now where people think that they can work 30, I'm talking about now middle class and even upper income people, think they can work 35 or 40 years and support 30 years of retirement. The average couple going to retirement goes in for 27 to 30 years. That's a life expectancy of roughly 20 per person, longer living the two being about 30. I'm sorry, the numbers don't add up. They don't add up whether you're talking about government paying for it. They don't add up whether you're talking about private saving. If you really wanted to, and the average person's retiring for a third of their adult lives. We're going to a system now where a third of the population is expected to be on Social Security. The numbers just don't add up. And there's sort of denial about whether this system, this structure we've created, of which PBGC is just one little piece, is just going to work. And if you want to fix them, you really have to start talking about big numbers. You just have to.
We need a Hurricane Sandy for financial security.
Congressman, you think that's right? Is that what it would take to get?
Well, I think its description is accurate, but the objection to the auto IRA on the Republican side is really not the cost, it's the mandate. That's what they object. They coming off the healthcare debate, mandate is just a poisonous term to them. So that's what their objection is. Although I think I've made a lot of headway with Dave Camp on this issue based on fact. I agree with the assessment as to where we're headed with retirement savings and longevity, life expectancy and all of that. But there's another pretty important number here, and that is the number of women in America who rely solely on Social Security. It's a pretty staggering number. And it's because they came from that generation where they worked very hard at home raising children, but they rely upon dad's Social Security benefit. And the number is of great consequence. And those are the things that it's hard to have the conversation about when the focus is always on the deficits. Now, am I concerned about the deficits? Yes. Am I obsessed with the deficits? No. I know something about Keynes. And I think the European experience right now on austerity is one that should give us great pause.
Yeah.
And I think that's a very important consideration. I mean, Great Britain went cold turkey, Ireland went cold turkey. The Germans on infrastructure, they might be talking about going cold turkey, but they're spending on infrastructure even as we meet. But I think there are all kinds of considerations, and I think with government expenditure that we need to be talking about these long-term investments. And I think retirement savings is a long-term investment. Infrastructure is a long-term investment. And these are things that government should continue to nurture. And it makes just a good deal of sense. I just want to take you back to this one quick, brief moment of frustration with me. Is there any issue that's gotten us into more trouble than the theology that tax cuts pay for themselves? Is there any issue that and it became so glitzy that the news media absorbed it and began to promote it as a theory? And I was baffled as I would go through the numbers all of the time. The tax cuts pay for themselves. If you follow that to its logical conclusion, then if we eliminate taxes, there's going to be a surplus.
I just want to say for the record, I never wrote that. I've got a bunch of cards up here, so I'm going to just start from right over here.
Hi, Michael Barr. Just a couple observations. Terrific opening discussion. I hesitate to say this, but on the way here, I was met quite delightfully at the Denver airport by the Aspen Institute's concierge, Lori. And we had a few minutes to chat. He said, "What kinds of things? What do you work on?" I explained what I work on. She said, "Well, that's me. I mean, I'm completely financially insecure." She had an operation that was not covered by her insurance, and it wiped out her savings, and she basically collapsed for a period of 5 or 6 years because of one medical incident. So it's not that any of these things are that far away from us, even among the Aspen Institute's concierge. And what we might have to do to help people in different circumstances is not all going to be the same. So for her, the critical issue for her financial security was not savings, it was health insurance. And we need to make sure that we keep that in the debate. Similarly, in my research in Detroit, there's enormous heterogeneity in the low and moderate income populations in terms of their experience being able to save. Saving for emergencies, especially quite critical for them, but savings also to build to buy a house or for some of them retirement. And so we need to keep in mind and be sensitive, I think, to when we bring it down to the household level, that each of these solutions is going to be different for different households. So for some of them, retirement savings, great, if we can do that. For others, not. I guess the third thing I'd say in relation to this opening discussion is it's actually remarkable that people save at all, given how really messed up our financial services system is for most people. It works really great for me, and I don't need the help. But if you're a moderate income person, if you're a low income person, forget it. You're not going to get the kind of advice you need. You're certainly not going to get access to the products you need. Our system of, this gets into the employer issue, our system of like who's liable for what in employee benefit plans is completely, it works against small and medium-sized businesses and their employees who tend to be lower wage workers as well. So I think given the mess we have, it's amazing anybody saves, and there are lots and lots of things we can do to clean it up pretty easily. But that brings me to my fourth and last observation, and it really goes to what Congressman Neal was talking about. I mean, Congressman Neal has put out a bunch of incredibly thoughtful, incredibly centrist, really effective policies, and the political environment is, horrible for them. They're exactly the kinds of things that it would be really hard to make a decent argument against. I mean, really. So I think part of the politics of this goes to this deficit point. Whenever there's a good idea out there, the deficit is all of a sudden like a really important thing to handle. But when we want to go attack Iraq for weapons of mass destruction they don't have, the deficit doesn't really matter. So I just think, I just think that we ought to call a spade, and the deficit conversation that we're having now is not a conversation about the health and strength of our country. It's a bludgeon to block good policy, and we ought to call it that.
That's a great point. In particular, I'm struck by what you say about health care, and I always remember the statistic about how a third of families that cycle in and out of poverty do so because of a health care emergency. So that's definitely worth talking about. Jean, you want to make a comment?
Yeah, I mean, some of this just fits together in a broad sense. I did some statistics recently, went back over, I think, from 79 to fairly close to the current period of time. And, you had median cash income as measured by the census is growing, median being the person at the 50th percentile, growing maybe, I'm trying to remember off the top of my head, with like 10%. You had Bureau of Economic Analysis numbers on per capita income, personal income growing by 70%. So what was the difference between the 10% and the 70%? Well, some of it is the unequal distribution of income. We know that's there. Nobody teases out. But a huge portion of it is also healthcare, because a lot of the income, the stagnating wages you're talking about, are cash wages.
Right.
And so for people who are getting health insurance and are at low to middle incomes, a huge amount of their income is going to health. By the way, that's not being saved. People don't usually save out of the health insurance being provided by employers. And back to my numbers I was talking about the Obama budget, but you could take a Ryan budget, anything. We're talking about spending several $100 billion more in public monies in 5 or 10 years from now. We're talking about spending several $100 billion more in private monies on health care. This is having an impact on our ability to make all of the sorts of shifts, whether it's for infrastructure or for personal savings or helping low-income people or doing some of the bills that Congressman Neal puts forward.
Josh, you want to make a comment?
This gets to Michael's comment, and actually, Congressman, one other myth, if you will, that I think has done a lot of damage is the myth that the market will take care of everything and government is not needed. And the reason I raise it, Michael, is because your point about that the deficit debate is being used in effect as a bludgeon and as an excuse, from my perspective, it is partly being used in essence to argue for less government action. In other words, people do not say, when in the Clinton administration, we balanced the budget.
4 times.
We balanced the budget by raising taxes, frankly, on people like me,
Right.
okay, and controlling spending. That's not what the debate has become. The debate has become, you got to control the deficit by cutting what government does. And so I think you're right. I think you're right that it's become an excuse rather than an even-handed discussion.
To your point about markets and government too, one thing we haven't really spoken that much about is financial reform and how that's progressing or not progressing. And
I understand you're going to have a panel on that.
Yeah, so we'll definitely come to that later. Damon, you had a comment?
I mean, as Michael said, this very erudite panel ranged widely over a lot of things, and a lot of things that are very important, and one could spend a lot of time talking about and fighting about, I suppose. The thing that I'm struck by and want your responses, and particularly I think in the vein of what Michael was saying about the sort of mysterious levels of opposition that very, very moderate proposals such as the auto IRA have generated. It's the following thing. The pension system that we had in the post-war era was the result of a compromise between the labor movement at the peak of its power and the corporate community. Right? The labor movement wanted a much more robust Social Security system, right? A Social Security system that would have paid more European-level income replacement, European social insurance system income replacement levels. I think in retrospect, there's no doubt, at least in my mind, that the country would have been far better off had we gotten our way, right? Because the Social Security system was portable, which the pension system that was created afterwards is not. The business community didn't want the government to have that kind of control over retirement provision. And they didn't want that for a bunch of different reasons, but one of them was that they had large businesses had a strategic objective in managing and bearing the kinds of things that Josh was talking about that they now don't like to bear. They had a strategic objective in having control over those assets, which was retention, which was trying to hold employees, particularly management employees, in place. Now, that whole thing, the political power dynamic that underlay that deal is gone, and the business strategy impetuses in our large employers that underlay that deal is largely gone, although not entirely, and that's why Josh still has responsibility for so many people's retirement security ultimately. seems to me that if we're going to have a conversation here in the next couple of days that is of any value, it's got to be about trying to figure out how we put some kind of deal like that together again. And I think we ought to learn a couple of things. I mean, I can say from the perspective, I could spend the time that I have with my card to, argue with you guys about different things you said that I disagree with, but it's not useful. I think what would be useful is to try to figure out how we might begin to construct that. I think the labor movement has learned two things. Not everybody in the labor movement has learned it, but I'm the policy director of the AFL-CIO. If I say we've learned it, maybe we have. Is A, that portability really matters. And the old style DB plan didn't have that. And B, to echo what Josh said, that it doesn't make sense to ask an employer whose specialty is serving food or writing software to be in the business of being a guarantor of a pension fund against the capital market risk. It's not. You're asking people to do something that doesn't fit what they are. If we were to take those two ideas as important ideas, and I think that what has been going on in California kind of has that as its base. If we take those two ideas as important ideas, you then have to have a conversation about two things that might be painful for other folks in society. And one of them, Congressman Neal, your proposal just barely touches on, which is the notion that the employer ought to have to pony up some dollars. You don't actually propose that. You just propose the employer ought to have to take some dollars out of the employee's paycheck.
With tax credits to
With
set up
tax
the
rates
system.
and all that, right. But I'm just saying that, you're just like barely getting there.
Yep.
But that's one issue. There's no retirement security system in the world that works that doesn't have that component. And the other issue is that if we're not going to ask the employer to be a fiduciary, we're going to have to ask somebody else to be a fiduciary. Right? And as I look around the room at the representatives of the financial service industry here, being a fiduciary is really different than running a for-profit financial services business. Right? You have sole loyalty to the beneficiaries. That's not a role that most financial institutions really have had much interest in playing. But somebody's got to do it, and they've got to be real. They've got to be a real power in the whole business if we're going to build a retirement security system that works. The challenge, I want to push you guys to talk about, can we imagine doing something like this? Can we put that together politically? Because it seems to me that's the agenda that we're, in many respects, to the extent we're talking about retirement security here and not the question of people like don't have bank accounts. To the extent we're talking about retirement security, we're talking about whether there is any promise in this kind of idea, and can we make it more than something that, people might, like me and Michael Barr, talk about. Right? Is it something that we can get more folks into the conversation?
I'd love to get your thoughts on that. And also, to your point about companies putting in more, it is striking, $2 trillion on the corporate balance sheets, record profitability.
That's $2 trillion offshore.
Well, that's a whole nother panel, I think. But what are the political obstacles to this?
Well, I think he makes a very good point about Social Security having been a compromise. People forget that. Roosevelt struck the middle ground on Social Security. Labor saying it wasn't enough and business saying it was too much. And that's how we arrived at that conclusion of old age parity. Now, the other part about it, I was tasked by Speaker Pelosi at the time to challenge the Bush Social Security Initiative. And I did it at a series of what I would refer to as the shirt and tie gang. Because they're the ones that are dubious about Social Security. Poor people are not dubious about Social Security. They're looking at that check. But as I did the Denver Forum and the City Club in San Diego, the game plan was to go back and forth with business people on the genius of Social Security. And one of the points that I made is I will always say to people in the middle class who have been kind of convinced that Social Security is going over the edge next January, no evidence to support it, but they'd like to manage those funds. So what I would always say is, how many of you in the audience have parents that are still living? And a lot of hands go up. And I will say to them, and how many of you have college-age children? The same hands go up. And I will say to them, let me tell you something. If you think, having sent four to college, if you think that you could care for ailing parents and simultaneously send those kids to college, big miscalculation. And I've said to huge Chamber of Commerce audiences, and it generally gets a chuckle, when I say to them, let me remind you of something. The reason mom and dad are not living in your attic is because of Social Security and Medicare. Treat these items very gingerly as we move down the road. And you will be surprised when you bring it to that level of parents and children. They look at it and say, gotcha. I mean, the genius of Social Security is the following. We all pull the wagon in our youth because we might have to sit in the wagon in our senior years. People get that. So I understand the notion that Medicare is more of a challenge, actuarially. There's no question about it. It's an immediate problem that we have. There are a lot of things you can do, by the way, on that front before you start to take you can use it with a butter knife rather than a hatchet to straighten it out. But Social Security is a very different argument. And, Social Security is Roosevelt's initiative, but the great amendment to Social Security, and that's how it was proposed, was Johnson's Medicare program. It's an amendment to the Social Security Act. And I think that it gives us a sense of community, that we're all in this together.
That's core. Josh, did you want to jump in on that?
I want to be half a dog in the manger to my friend Damon. I don't disagree with anything that you said as to diagnosis. And then you raised two, in my view, really important issues. One is, all right, if you're letting employers off the regulatory hook, off the fiduciary hook, and you're turning them into a distribution system, shouldn't you also say they have to write part of the check too? Shouldn't they be more than just a passive means for employees to agree to do their own payroll deduction? I get that. However, my personal view, and actually I'm certain there's no federal policy on this one, but it's clearly personal. My personal view is that to the extent that that is required, unless there is an overall mandatory scheme, I think we will not get participation. So I think there's a trade-off between...
I don't disagree with that at all.
Right. And so from my perspective, if you're saying to me, would I personally, and I got to be real clear since a lot of people would shoot me if I spoke on behalf of my administration, even though we care about this stuff. If I personally had to choose between a universal access, like the kind that Senator De Leon is trying to do in California, and a requirement that employers pay some actual cash themselves, I'd take the former. But I recognize it's a trade-off, and I think it's important that we do recognize that. The second issue you raise is, in my view, the more important one and the harder one, because we have, as you rightly pointed out, we as a nation reached a deal almost 40 years ago now, under ERISA, which said we will count on employers to be responsible and watch and take care of their employees. We will not force employees to fend for themselves and to have to figure out how to be investment professionals. We said that was the deal we made, and over the succeeding generation, or two generations, whichever it is, employers have said, I'm just not there. I don't want to do it. What we have not done is we have not had a serious debate about what the replacement for that is. If you let employers off the hook, and personally I think it is essential to let employers off the hook. I think it is essential that employers become a way of getting retirement security rather than a way of guaranteeing retirement security. But that means someone else has to do it. And Senator De Leon's proposal is that, as I understand it, and since it's still formed, if I misrepresent what you're saying, please correct me, is that a new institution created by the state will take that responsibility. Other people have said that the financial services industry should, with appropriate government oversight, take that responsibility. Unfortunately, thus far, the financial services industry, when faced with that prospect, at least as regulated by the Department of Labor, has said in terms more polite than I'm about to, NFW. But I think that's the real challenge. The question is, from the constellation of potential new institutions, the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, the existing federal agencies, state agencies, and the financial services industry, who will protect? Who will provide the
Do
protection?
you want to make one quick?
Just one quick anecdote to
Yes.
follow up on what Josh said. MassMutual is the third largest life insurance company in America. They have all these very sophisticated, good products that they sell. Great life insurance, great employer, great corporate citizen in Springfield. Inside of MassMutual, they have a credit union. You see the employees, if you're there having lunch, the employees line up with the credit union, do their transactions inside of this big life insurance company.
I'm going to get to this side of the table, but Senator, do you want to jump in? Thoughts?
Thank you so much. Just a couple commentaries and a few observations. First, I want to just thank Congressman Neal for all his hard work and his forward thinking in the Congress in Washington, D.C. You used the word mandate, and the word mandate is a very loaded word. It's a very politicized word. You know, the same thing if folks concur or not concur with the health exchange and with quote unquote Obamacare, it's become very politicized and it has a very visceral reaction. I was really struck by a conversation I had yesterday during the reception with David Johns, formerly from the Heritage Foundation and now with AARP, and that Oregon has passed a few stages legislatively, still have a long way to go, but a few stages legislatively with regards to promoting their own retirement security, and that it was voted on an ideological split, Democrats and Republicans. And it struck me because in Washington, D.C., as well as in California, the vote in California was ideological. It was partisan, I should say, not ideological. Democrats for, Republicans against. And when you think about the idea and the concept of automatic enrollment, auto IRA, it's about personal responsibility. It's about individual responsibility. It's about taking control, if you will,
Yep.
of your future and what that means, you know, once you retire. And if you're going to have the ability to sort of control your journey, these are sort of buzzwords, if you will, that resonate with Republicans. Personal responsibility, individual responsibility. And what struck with me in California was that it was a big, massive debate. It was polarizing, it was polemic. The media covered it greatly. You had a lot of lobbyists and lawyers fly out from Washington, D.C., from New York, some from Massachusetts, a lot from Connecticut. Connecticut is the headquarters industry to a lot of the annuities and life insurance corporations.
The Hartford, yeah.
Hartford, Connecticut. And what was struck was at times the debate was not, this issue was not debated on the merits, not on the arithmetic, not on public policy and what the projection is for the future for all taxpayers, regardless of your ideology of your party and what it means money-wise, but rather the script that was handed by the financial services industry. It's just a reality. You know? You're supposed to pose this because this is a defined benefit program for private sector workers now, let alone forget about DB for public sector. They're trying to move this. The taxpayers will be liable for hundreds of billions of dollars. And then there's this complex thing called ERISA, the Employee Retirement Individual Security Act, which the vast majority of members of Congress, and I would venture to say the vast majority of members of the legislative bodies throughout the country don't even have a clue and understand it.
That's accurate.
I've had an opportunity to understand it extremely well now. And what's fascinating is how this has become ideological when it shouldn't be ideological. This is as bipartisan as it gets. You know, absent perhaps what Damon would advocate for, and a handful of folks around this table would advocate for, would be the concept and philosophy of shared responsibility by the employer, himself or herself. Obviously, that's a larger question. But I just wanted to throw that out. But it seems like it's not a mathematical problem. It's not a policy problem. It's a political problem.
No question.
You know, and the dysfunction in D.C. is so severe that I've been there 4 times in the past year to deal with the Treasury and DOL. And each time I walk out of there, outside the executive branch, you know, it's just, I'm just stunned at the current state in Congress. I'm just stunned beyond belief.
Yeah.
Let's move, just because we have 10 minutes left over here, and make sure that folks get a chance.
I wanted to pull off your question, which was why isn't this a bigger issue for our society? And really ask Congressman Neal, with HR 1 being a major discussion topic, HR 1 is the most important bill in the House of Representatives, which is being set aside for tax reform. Are any of these pieces of the conversation that we're talking about today, either your bill with auto IRA or, even better, a conversation about refundable savers credits or increasing the incentives for low-income people save, is that part of this conversation? I'm always hopeful that we will have hit this moment where we could be. And if it's not, is the only way to have that broader conversation to do it in the context of really making Social Security solvent over the longer term and saying that again, that's only one leg of the stool. Surprisingly, although we're very public about it, ARP really supports a conversation about making sure that Social Security is solvent. But I'm hopeful we can do more than just that. I'm hoping that we can do some of the goals that we're talking about today. What is the vehicle for having that broader conversation?
Well, on the first count, we've had, I think these models that Dave Camp has developed have actually been very helpful to the process. There's a wide-ranging opportunity for people who are, as you correctly stated, Senator, who are not up to speed on some of these issues. And so you've heard this expertise that's been developed, why the issue has been included, what it's supposed to enhance, what it's supposed to incent. And at the same time, I think that Camp is very genuine in trying to get this done. But in the private conversation that I had with him in 208, which is really a historic room in the Capitol, it's where Andrew Jackson held court. It's where Thaddeus Stevens held court, the Ways and Means Committee. And what's striking about the conversation when I said to Dave, revenue. We want some revenue on the table. Can you do revenue? And he said, no. I mean, it's not Dave Camp. It's trying to sell it to his caucus. And so my own sense is that what they're thinking, without having said it, but you can read between the lines on this, because we also had a pretty good get-together with Max Baucus and some members of the Finance Committee. Baucus is clearly headed toward revenue. And my sense is, the exit ramp is there for Baucus, maybe for Camp, and certainly for Obama. And they're looking for the big deal at the end. But we still have a long way to go on this. I'm quoted in Politico this morning as saying, at best, this is 50-50, at best. But what I've advised my caucus to do is to stay in the conversation. I mean, this notion, as you've described it accurately, that we don't get one thing, so we move away from the conversation. Stay in the conversation, see what you can engage, what you can push for up until the very end. And if the opening position is the same at the closing position, well, I got you. You can't do much with that. But try to keep it fluid. So I think that keeping separate, I don't see a deal coming where we're going to do anything about Social Security. That's a non-starter with Democrats. I think Dave Camp gets that. And at the same time, I think that by having Baucus put revenue on the table, and he and Camp are going to begin these conversations across the country, I think that there might be some room there for Camp to say this is the best that we can get. I mean, the president on New Year's Eve and spending New Year's Eve with my colleagues in Congress, not one of the more enjoyable New Year's Eves. As Leader Pelosi tried to put a happy face on it at the restaurant, how happy she was we were all together. Wish we could have had a private vote on that. But my point is that I think that Camp really wants to do this. I think Baucus certainly wants to do it. Last caveat, the president needs to weigh in at some point. They're standing back from all of it, I think largely because they're dubious as to whether or not it can happen, and they're not going near something that they don't think is going to work.
Okay.
Deborah, I think you hinted at the result. Tax reform right now is a debate between base broadening, which is revenue raising, to cut the deficit, or base broadening to cut tax rates. It's generally speaking not the types of things like I've mentioned the types of numbers you need. If you really want to increase pension savings, you're talking about significant revenue losses. And what makes it even worse, it's over the 10-year period, because a lot of your losses are up front and you collect the revenues down the road on deferred compensation. So that's hard to do in any big way in that tax reform discussion. But I think you hinted at where I think there is room. If we ever did, I'm saying this year, if we ever did major Social Security reform, and I've been pushing for this, had sessions on this, to do like the British did and actually try to have a significant pension reform as an add-on to Social Security, whether it's a mandate or almost a mandate or something in between, I mean, the type of discussion we're going to have today, then we're talking, as you know, from ARP, we're talking trillions. And in that type of context, pension reform it seems to me is quite viable. And to say the British did it a few years ago by combining them both together. So I think there are opportunities, but I think the big bucks in fostering retirement savings or even fostering savings in general are not going to come along in this particular tax reform debate because of its emphasis on base broadening, not on losing revenue.
Okay, let's try and get a couple more comments in. David?
I'll try to make this one brief. First off, I think, yes, we need to look at the British experience in great detail because they actually managed to take a huge step towards solving a problem, which is sort of an unusual context in this day and time. One of the things, looking at the overall title of this session, macroeconomic growth, things along that line, I want to make sure that we don't lose sight of one tiny little mechanism that I think can be used more and has huge potential, and that's the ESOP.
Yeah.
We have a situation right now where we have a tremendous number of companies that are owned by baby boomers who are in transition here. We can either put them in a position where they sell out to somebody else, where the company gets absorbed and a lot of people lose their jobs, whether that's U.S. companies or foreign companies, or they go out of business, or we can turn around and sell this to the employee. And yes, it has to be structured properly. There are a lot of safeguards that have to be done here, but this is one of the other mechanisms that I think is going to be crucial going forward to building savings, because that really is a feeling of saving. It's an asset for the individual.
You would not know the difference between management and employees with an ESOP.
Exactly.
You couldn't tell the difference if you're in the room with them.
Gary?
Two things. One, I wanted to take the conversation about savings and combine it a little bit with the conversation about jobs and globalization last night. I mean, I think one of the reasons you don't see a lot of innovation around savings from financial institutions and capital markets is because there is a glut of global savings. So your point about, a Chinese couple living in a hut, the fact that they're saving that money is getting used elsewhere in the system for lending. And so without a huge demand for savings by U.S. institutions to lend, then you're not going to need that innovation. So I think some of the huge global imbalances around consumption actually feed this problem. And the transition of labor that then requires us to deal with the savings problem is exacerbated by sort of the global imbalance. One of the things that you said, Josh, about the CFPB, Michael can speak more about this because he was actually part of writing the bill, but investments and insurance are strictly prohibited from the purview of the CFPB and remains with the Department of Labor, SEC, insurance commissioners. There are some small things that can be done, but I can tell you that any kind of interest that has been expressed about that has been met with massive resistance from the Hill. And so as Dodd-Frank imagines consumer protection, it is restricted to mostly credit products and deposits, but restricts from insurance and investment, which is a huge part of how consumers engage in their financial lives. Talk about that more, but that there is currently, as it exists today, there's a pretty thick wall between those two worlds.
I think that's a great point. And actually, I would just also add that there's a kind of a regional discussion in Europe about this very thing, the savings and wage imbalances too, that I think we could take lessons from. Does anybody want to comment?
To your point about CFPB, I have had explained to me in exquisite detail the limitations on what CFPB can and cannot do, the limitations on what the Labor Department can do, the limitations on what Treasury can do. My point is not necessarily that within the current law that they can or cannot do any particular thing. My point is that, as Damon has pointed out, that we need to rethink the current law. We need to recognize that the world has changed, and we need to have the humility to recognize that maybe our first cut at what the right set of responsibilities are for CFPB or somebody else may not be the final cut.
Okay, Lynn, I'm going to give you the last comment,
Okay.
and I think we're going to go to break.
Thanks. Just a quick comment on the structural issues relative to the retirement system. To me, the notion of a three-legged stool is really solid. So historically, we had pension, we had my own savings, and then we had the Social Security component. And what's happened is the employer piece, as the discussion has yielded here, has been kicked out from underneath that. And the defined contribution plan now, the 401k, typically rolls into the IRA when someone moves from employer to employer. So you essentially still have a sort of a two-legged stool. To me, one of the ideas that could be explored further would be the use of a 401k to reinstate the third-legged stool, such that you have employer-enabled savings or my work site savings. You have my own savings, and you have my Social Security. And the least selected option with a 401k rollover is rolling it forward into your next employer. In fact, most people, 75% of people will roll that into an IRA. So very quickly, as the American moves from job 1 to 2 to 3 to 4 to the 6 or 7 employers they have over the course of a career, all the money that's saved for retirement comes into that my savings bucket. And so thinking about this three-legged stool and how can we encourage more people to roll forward? How can the system encourage more people to roll their 401ks forward to the next employer through my 6 or 7 employers that I have over the course of the career, so that when I am ready to retire, now I have a three-legged stool. I have a bucket of money that I saved at my employer. I have a bucket of money that I saved, and I have my Social Security. And I think it provides that solid foundation of a three-legged stool that would allow people to think about how to generate annuitized income that could complement their Social Security income in addition to their nest egg.
Okay, before we go to break, in the interest of sticking with action and results, I want to do a speed round and have each of you tell me very quickly what you think is the most important takeaway from what you've heard today and what policy action could be implemented that you think would actually help. How about that? In 10 words. Just kidding.
10 words, I think you got to go for the big money, and I think that means shoring up, by the way, all the legs of the stool, which I think are all weak. I think it means dealing with issues that are far beyond what we're going to talk about today, having to do with the budget and healthcare and getting our financial house in order. I think in terms of what we're talking about today, I think we go close to a mandate, but not quite there, and we get employer contributions. I think we have to have employers involved, even if not at a fiduciary level. On the retirement end, I think we got to get people, we're not going to talk a lot about it today, I think we got to get people back into mortgages to get them to save on that front. And then, well, that's what I'll take away.
Josh?
One, get the country moving again and get economic growth again.
I think that was 10 words.
Okay.
You win.
Second, find ways to take the advantages of employers for retirement security and capitalize on them in ways that employers will stand for.
I think to calm the incendiary rhetoric, I think the excitable language is not helpful to the national conversation.
Okay, well, that's a great point to end on. Thank you all, and thanks for everybody's comments.